All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get underway. Thanks again for being with us today. Welcome to the Lubar Center at Eckstein Hall here at Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by Professor Richard Florida. He is the author of this new book. It's called The New Urban Crisis: How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. Professor Florida, you may remember from about 15 years ago, he wrote sort of a groundbreaking book at that time, 2002. It was called The Rise of the Creative Class. It was sort of looked at what was going to happen in urban areas around this country, the Back to the City movement, and why it was happening. So here we are 15 years later. Richard Florida is a professor. He's director of cities at the University of Toronto's Martin Prosperity Institute. That's in the Rodham School of Management. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. And he's also known for his work with The Atlantic and the creation of what I think is really the best website for urban issues. It's called CityLab. So if you have a chance, check that out. He's doing a lot of interesting work on cities, and we are delighted to have him here with us at Marquette Law School today. Won't you please give a warm welcome to Professor Richard Florida.
Thank you. Thank you.
So 15 years has passed since the rise of the creative class. What's happened to cities in America and around the world during that time?
Well, in that book, I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, a city that's not unlike Milwaukee, an older industrial blue-collar town. That saw many of its young people leaving, was no longer exporting steel, but was exporting the talent that came there. And I wanted to understand the urban revival that was going on in places like San Francisco or New York or Boston and Washington. And what I found is there was this group of people called the creative class. Well, I call them the creative class. They didn't call themselves the creative class. Techies, entrepreneurs, professionals, young professionals, people in work, knowledge work, who use their mind rather than their hands to work, people in the arts and entertainment field. A third of our workforce, 40 or 45 million people, who really like this urban kind of living. Sometimes they wanted to live in a city center if they were younger. Other times they wanted to live in a walkable suburb with a downtown when they got a little older and had a family. But I think, to be honest, Mike, I really underpredicted. I was very rosy-eyed and optimistic this creative class would bring back the cities, but boy, oh boy, in this past 15 years, we've seen an urban revival on steroids. Coming here yesterday and staying at the Iron Horse, seeing what's happening around the old factory buildings, the Harley-Davidson Museum, going downtown, grabbing something to eat, watching a game in a rooftop bar at the end of the game. It's amazing what's happened here. Now, that's happened in city after city, and so what the new urban crisis is about, the fact that there was this unanticipated or unintended consequence, that as this smaller group, the creative class, about a third of us, a little bit more of that than that in Milwaukee, began to benefit from the urban revival, the gap between the affluent third and the remaining 60% grew across our entire country. Inequality grew, segregation of groups living like-minded with like-minded, like income with like income grew, and our middle class declined, our housing became less affordable. So the urban revival was great, but it conferred a disproportionate share of benefits on one group, and other groups weren't participating.
You describe what we've seen as winner-take-all urbanism. What do you mean by that?
Well, in the book, we've talked a lot about a winner-take-all economy before, and there's been great books on this. The idea that, whether it's LeBron James or a great sports star, a great movie, The Rock, for example, CEOs that used to make 4 or 5 or 10 times the average worker now make 350 times on average what the average worker makes. But we never thought about winner-take-all cities and winner-take-all urbanism. The fact that a small group of cities and metro areas, particularly those on the coast, the New York, Boston, Washington corridor, San Francisco Bay Area, and there's others, the Southern California area, have really prospered. London, Paris, we can go on. But other parts of the country and other parts of the world have fallen behind. I think that's what's behind some of the political backlash we've seen. But it's not just a growing geographic inequality or winner-take-all urbanism across places, it's within. That's the other part the book talks about. Even within the most successful cities, you have winner areas and loser areas, winner neighborhoods and loser areas. But one dramatic chart, I wrote in the book, I quite like it, and other publications have liked it. We looked at the number of houses you could buy for the price of one small 1,500, think about it, 1,500 square foot apartment in Soho in Manhattan. That price is now about $3.5 million. On a square foot basis, it's about $3,000 per square foot. I don't have the exact figures with me, but you could buy 20 houses in Chicago, 30 houses in Atlanta, 50 houses in Detroit, 100 houses in Youngstown, Ohio. So that's an example of this kind of winner-take-all phenomenon.
You said there are actually different tiers to this phenomenon, too. There are the superstar cities. These are what, the New Yorks, the Tokyos? Describe that for us.
Well, yeah, I think that what we've seen is these superstar cities have been attracting disproportionate levels of talent. They've become the talent hubs. Now they're struggling a little more as housing prices get so exorbitant. They've attracted extraordinary shares of investment, extraordinary shares of technology. And there's one statistic in the book that I find quite shocking. In the year 1990, the San Francisco Bay Area, that includes the San Francisco, the city, and the Silicon Valley, where the tech companies were, and many still are, attracted about 20% of all venture capital-backed high-tech investment. In the year 2015, that same area attracted 50%. So high-tech has not spread, it's concentrated. The only area that has really upped its ante in high-tech venture capital-backed startups across the United States in a big way is New York City. New York City had very little. It had finance, it had investment, it had real estate, it had entertainment and media, but didn't have many tech startups. Now it is second. Second only to San Francisco, ahead of Boston, ahead of Austin, ahead of Seattle, and ahead of the classic Silicon Valley, believe it or not, with about $7 billion in venture capital investment. One other statistic. The high-tech companies have really become urban. They've become part of the urban revival. They no longer are so clustered. A big change.
Yeah.
In the past they were in these suburban office parks. A friend of mine called them a nerdistan, Now it's true.
Somebody just not work in the tech industry, or
Facebook and has a big campus, and Apple has a big campus, and of course Microsoft has a big campus in Seattle. They're big companies. They have to have a lot of large floor plates. But across the country today, we looked at the data, more than half of all venture capital startups are in urban areas. That still means half are in suburbia, but more than half are in urban areas. And here's the statistic. There are two neighborhoods in downtown San Francisco that looked a little bit like the area around the Iron Horse, older industrial neighborhoods that were basically abandoned. They had nothing going on, derelict old factories. Those two neighborhoods in downtown San Francisco now collect well over $1 billion in venture capital-backed investment per year, more than any other nation on earth outside of the United States. So in many ways, this winner-take-all phenomenon is between places, but also there's winners and losers within places as well.
And one of the, I think you called it an ironic attribute to economic success, is that we have seen in some of these cities wild rates of inequality, where you have people making a ton and people making very little. It almost goes hand in hand with economic success.
Yeah, one of the things that I really wanted to dig into, which I mentioned to you, I had moved to Toronto in 2007, and I thought I was going to the urbanist, for urbanists like me, the nirvana of urbanism. The greatest urbanist of all time, Jane Jacobs, wrote the book on the death and life of great American cities. She's from Scranton, lived in New York, wrote that book about New York City and Greenwich Village in the 60s. She moved to Toronto and lived out the rest of her life there. And I got to Toronto, and not far thereafter, after I moved, I don't know if you know Toronto's politics, but we elected the crack mayor, Rob Ford. And really the first populist, the first before Trump, before Brexit, the first really the product of this backlash. And really, although the people in my neighborhood, in the inner city core neighborhood, in the areas around the university, in the areas around transit lines, beautiful old renovated urban neighborhoods were doing quite well, Ford pointed out that these urban elites were taking the gravy train, actually a phrase Trump took from him, the gravy train, were making off with the gravy train and the regular people. And in his case, it wasn't just white workers. It was a multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition, Caribbean, Indian, Chinese immigrants, as well as white Canadians, who were saying, my God, I want more opportunity. So anyway, what that struck me is that even in a place that was different than our cities, which has different problems, different attributes, the divide was growing. The divide between really about 20% to a third of us who are members of this creative class. I have the statistics for Milwaukee here, about 250,000 workers. But they're growing apart from the other two-thirds 350,000 workers who work in low-wage routine service jobs like food preparation, the caring professions, home health care aides, office work, 44% of your workforce, and another 180,000 blue-collar workers, another 20% of your workforce. So that divide was growing, and as you said, when we looked at the data, we found something quite striking. The larger your city and metropolitan area was, the denser it was, the more you had an urban thing going on, the more knowledge institutions you had, the bigger your creative class was, the more high-tech startups you have, and ironically, the more liberal your political leadership was, either in terms of your mayor or in terms of voting for president, the more unequal that metropolitan area was, the more economically segregated it was, and the smaller its middle class was. So this was a great irony, if you will, or a great dilemma. Our most successful, our most productive, our most innovative, and most liberal metropolitan areas were also our most unequal and our most divided.
What are the consequences of that great class divide you just described?
Well, first I do want to say, because I came armed with some statistics for you. Look, Milwaukee has done a fabulous job of renovating itself, a fabulous job of reviving what you've accomplished in your downtown and adjacent districts, which I've seen over the past 15 years since first visiting here, is quite remarkable. No, you do not have the level of an urban crisis of a New York or a San Francisco or a Los Angeles or a Houston or even a Chicago, but the signals are there. I have the statistics on income inequality, 26th out of large metropolitan areas. On income segregation, the segregation of low-income groups, 4th. On the segregation of the poor, number 1 in Milwaukee. Segregation of the wealthy, how much the wealthy are able to wall themselves off from other groups, 15th. Now, in the New Urban Crisis Index, you rank 69. About 60th in the country. So by no means is this is an index that measures inequality and segregation and housing affordability. But the signal is there that you have to address it. And the ramifications of this divide are that we really are two different countries. We're a country of reasonably well-to-do people who live in nice suburban neighborhoods or great urban neighborhoods, who work in knowledge professions, and another country that is people trapped in either routine blue-collar work that's disappearing, right, factory work, or more likely women, mainly women, Hispanic, Latino, African-American, people working in low-wage service jobs. And in big metros, those people are no longer able to live in a suburb with a good transportation connection or a rail link. They're no longer able to live in the downtown area. They're commuting an hour and a half, or 2 hours. I just want to give you one other statistic. This is very typical in Toronto. You wouldn't think of Toronto as a place like New York or Chicago or London. For a service worker, a nanny, a worker in a caring profession, a service worker, a food preparation, that worker on average is traveling 1.5 to 2 hours per way to get to work. When I get my hair cut in New York City when I visit, I often ask the attendant who may shampoo my hair before the haircut, where do you live? I live someplace in outlying New Jersey. I live in Long Island. It takes me, 90 minutes to take a train to a subway to another thing to get here. In Toronto, again, this is not New York, this is not London. Can you guess what the median price of a attached single-family home, non-condominium in the city of Toronto is? $1.5 million. $1.5 million. Who can afford that? Not someone in the caring profession, not someone in food preparation, not someone with a blue-collar job, not a young person, unless, I ask my students this. I teach in the business school. We have a classroom just like this where I teach my students. I asked them one day, I said, so you guys, you're the most prosperous, you're in the best business school in Canada, you're on track to have great jobs. Who of you can afford to buy a home in the city if you decide to live here? And the one young man said, Professor Florida, that's an easy question. The only way you do that is if you have the bank of mom and dad. So that means not only in these superstar cities does your ability to have parents with advantages put you in the right school or the right neighborhood, that literally if you want to insert yourself into one of these labor markets in your industry, the only way you can do that if you're going to have a family is mom and dad have to bankroll you. So I think that's the dilemma we're at. In the winner-take-all system, it really reinforces the advantages of the advantages, and it magnifies the disadvantages of the less advantaged.
You talked about the professional class, the service class, but something that I know really bothers you and something that you've seen become much more pronounced in the last 15 years or so is the disappearance of the middle class. What did you find in your research?
Well, you know, I love telling stories, so you have to allow me to go out on a tangent. I was born in 1957 in Newark, New Jersey. I was born into a middle-class neighborhood in a middle-class city. My dad was a factory worker. My dad only had a 7th grade education. He worked in a factory making eyeglasses, Victory Optical. You know, he worked hard, and he was able to save up and buy a house in a suburb called North Arlington, New Jersey. He lived next door to my Uncle Walter. My dad and my uncle married 2 sisters. My mom, they're both from families of 7, but my mom was the youngest, her sister, my Aunt Lonnie. My dad worked in the factory, 7th grade education. His brother-in-law, my Uncle Walter, went to college at night, got a master's degree in engineering, was a vice president of engineering at Colgate-Palmolive. They lived together on the same street. When I was a boy in the 1970s, 70% of Americans lived in a middle-class neighborhood. Not only were members of the middle class, lived in a middle-class neighborhood, which were our platforms for upward mobility. That's what enabled me to escape a working-class Italian-American neighborhood and get a college scholarship, go to Rutgers, and put my life on a great course. Today, less than 40% of us do, and I'm sure when the next census is out, it's going to be less than a third. In 203 metropolitan areas for which the Pew Research Center 229 metropolitan areas, so that's more than 9 in 10, in which the Pew Research Center can collect data, the middle class has declined in America. So if the old urban crisis was about the movement of the middle class out of Milwaukee to the suburbs, out of my Newark to the suburbs of New Jersey, out of New York City, the middle class, they called it the middle class flight, what the new urban crisis really is about is the emptying and evisceration of the middle class as we fracture into small areas of advantage, many in the suburbs, some in the city, and much larger areas of concentrated disadvantage with no bridge between them.
You mentioned the suburbs, and this is one of the interesting chapters in this book, is about what's happened to the suburbs. And I think probably in the Milwaukee area, we have this image of the suburbs as being green and lush and prosperous, and life is good, and we've got picket fences and all of that stuff. But you're saying that your research indicates that the suburbs are seeing much greater levels of poverty than in years past.
Well, I think as a consequence of the urban revival, you know, as people, and not just young people, as baby boomers, you know, traded in that suburban home and their equity and many times followed their kids back to the city, bankrolled their kids and bought a condominium for themselves. What we now know is the top 10% of income earners have moved back to the city. The bottom 10% of income earners have moved out of the city. The level of poverty now in the suburbs is higher. There are more poor people in suburbs in America than there are in cities, and the rate is growing faster. When I met with the former mayor of Washington, D.C., Tony Williams, recently, he said to me, it was remarkable, you know, we're talking about this 15-year period since he and I met and I wrote Rise of the Creative Class. It was remarkable what's happened to Washington, D.C. in this influx of affluence. Now, Barack and Michelle just spent how much for a house there? I think it was $8.1 million on Colorama, which when I lived in Washington, D.C. wasn't a great neighborhood, by the way. Colorama was a neighborhood under some threat. So $8.1 million, bringing in very rich people from both parties, you know, but that the poverty had been pushed out to Prince George County, which is a largely African-American county that abuts Washington, D.C., and he said it was really a big issue. Washington had benefited, but Prince George County had really... So what we're finding is in many metropolitan areas, and I do think this was a big factor in the election, by the way, that if you look at the election, it wasn't swing states. Well, we know that if you look at the map. It was really distressed suburbs. And one of the interesting findings about distressed suburbs, subject for another symposium, is that they're very politically volatile. The people who live in these very economically distressed suburbs swing from blue to red. They're not predictable, and often they go back. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of a backlash because they're so anxious and so upset. So basically, it's these distressed suburbs that are growing. They're growing at a rapid rate, and I say in the book, I call it an urban crisis, but in many ways, the suburban dimension of the new urban crisis is even larger. One, because there are more people that live in suburbs still in America, but two, but if you're in a suburb, you don't have the support structures. You don't have the support services. You don't have the access to transit. You don't have the social services that you do in a city, so you're kind of cut off. So I think that suburban dimension is something we need to consider.
A lot of people in this room who probably want to hear about your ideas for addressing some of the issues we see in cities today. And I want to walk through a number of these, but I want to begin with something that we were talking about just a short time ago, and that is this notion of using anchor institutions to help do important work in cities. So I'd ask you to just spend a couple minutes talking about what anchor institutions are and the difference you believe they can make in the fortunes of a city.
Well, you know, we were talking about this, and I hear it every city I go to, every community, every metropolitan area I go to. And this isn't just a result of this last election. I think it's been a result of the past 15 years. The federal government is not going to bail us out. You know, Gerald Ford once said to New York, drop dead, we're not going to bail you out of bankruptcy, but I think the long-run trajectory has been of less federal investment, and sometimes people look to the federal government to solve urban problems. That may have been the case in parts of the 60s and 70s. It isn't anymore, and it's not just because of the current election. So we got to do it ourselves. I think that's a big thing, a big wake-up call for me, that the progress we have made is local. The progress in rebuilding and reviving cities like Milwaukee or Chicago or Toronto has been because of local effort and these so-called anchor institutions. The classic example of an anchor institution we're sitting in, a university or a college. It has a big physical presence in a community and it employs lots of people. Often in anchor institutions like universities or medical centers, a lot of the staff not only work there, but especially professors, they like to walk to work. And students, of course, live close, so there's purchasing power in the area. Other examples are large real estate developers that are developing not one-off buildings, but large districts. There are a number of communities around the country where these real estate developers are developing 50 or 60 or 70 or 100-acre mixed communities. And then the final one are big companies. Harley-Davidson we're talking about here. Amazon is the single biggest employer in the city of Seattle. We could go on. So one of the things that they've done is focused on economic development, job creation, technology transfer, incubating new businesses. They've been part of this urban revival. But in a way, they've been part of the problem. And I've heard this from their leaders. I'm not imposing on them. We were just in Philadelphia, and I was meeting with the heads of Drexel and the University of Pennsylvania and saying, we've created economic growth, but the divide has grown. And one of the striking statistics in my book is actually places that are very unequal tend to be college towns. Ann Arbor, Madison, you know, Boulder. They have the rich and the poor, if you will, the affluent and less advantaged. So one of the things we've been talking about is how can these anchor institutions not only spur innovation and technology transfer and economic development, how can they develop more and better strategies for inclusion? How can they work more proactively to make sure their neighborhoods are benefiting? How can they build not only housing for their students and faculty and employees? My visiting appointment at NYU, I was saying, I live in affordable housing. I live in an NYU apartment in which the rent is not subsidized, the rent is reduced. How can they do that for community residents? How can they make their community safer? How can they create better schools? How can they create employment upgrading programs? The whole gamut of things that make for a stronger and more inclusive community. So I think anchors are an important part, our community anchors are an important part of the solution.
The final chapter, I think, of the book talks about 7 pillars, things that you could do to solve problems, address issues in urban areas. One of them that I think is important to talk about is your belief that infrastructure investment is a good idea. What do you mean by infrastructure investment, and why do you think that makes a difference? Well, you know, I think obviously we've not invested enough in our infrastructure in the United States. Parts of it are falling down, you know. I see it from my friends who live in New York City. It's now the subway and rail system starting to seize up. It's so old, it's really starting to seize up, and there's so much pressure on it. So I think we need to build infrastructure, and I think we need to build infrastructure that connects us. And so 2 things, I think we need more transit between our cities and our suburbs so that we can connect those distressed parts of the suburbs or nice parts of the suburbs to the city. But I also think we need to think very long and hard about high-speed rail. That this is a way to really connect places like Milwaukee to Chicago. Where I live, Hamilton, a working class town, to Toronto. And 2 economists at the University of California at Berkeley have this really interesting paper
which is all about another subject in the book, which you talk about if you like, about land use restrictions and how you have to liberalize zoning codes and spur more building and get more towers and density. And they have a footnote in that paper in which they say, but if we did all of that, that would be great. But if we just had a high-speed rail line from San Francisco to like Sacramento and a little farther out, and we made Sacramento a commutable suburb, it would have so much bigger effect because it would increase the labor market and talent market, enable people to live out in affordable housing out in Sacramento that they couldn't in San Francisco. It would have a humongous effect. So, in fact, in Toronto, in Ontario, where I live, we are thinking about building that high-speed rail link, not only out to Hamilton, but out over to Windsor near Detroit, so that people in Windsor whose factory jobs closed up could have more opportunity in a place like Toronto.
Give us a sense of the attitude towards mass transit in other places around this country, because here, this is, I mean, well, a brief little history, you know, we had an opportunity to build a high-speed rail system, and Governor Walker said, no, I don't want to do that. We're not going to spend money on that, please. So we had that. We are currently building a streetcar system, the first leg of a streetcar system in the city of Milwaukee, but that has been very controversial. People wondering why it doesn't go further, why it doesn't connect more workers to that. Is it just a trolley for downtown folks and the people who are the elites? Is mass transit controversial elsewhere? Are we different?
Well, it's controversial everywhere, and that's why we haven't built nearly enough of it. But we have built infrastructure in the past. You know, if you look at American history, our canals spurred the first development. Our rail system and our rail interconnection created an integrated nation, economically integrated nation. Our system of subways and streetcars built our cities, and then our interstate highway system built this country. So we need to, it's always been the leader of economic development, and it's always connected us. Look, the ironic fact is one of the biggest spurs of urban gentrification is transit. Rich people in big cities are dying to live near transit. They pay a heck of a lot more money, all the research shows, to live not only near the core, but live near a transit hub. Why? Because they can avoid congestion on the roads, they have a quicker commute to work, they can get to work faster and spend more time with their family. So the prices around transit hubs are being bid up. I spent part of the year in Florida, just because my name is Florida, of course. Because I live in Toronto and it's really cold. Yesterday it was 49 degrees. So, yeah, my wife's not happy. But the Governor Scott there said no to high-speed rail. And a private sector consortium came in and is building it. It's called All Aboard Florida, because they believe by connecting Orlando and Miami and Tampa, they can make a big pile of money, and they're going to build a very upscale, very lovely, and hopefully someone will create a subsidy, maybe some foundations or something for lower income people to use it. But I think there's a market now, and if government won't do it, certainly there's a market for doing it in big metropolitan areas, and it will get done. But the real point of fact is that rich people who often wanted to avoid transit now are finding that transit is the key to their ability to move around.
You describe an inclusive urbanism in the book, urbanism for all. Part of that for you at this moment is affordable housing. What do you see happening on that front?
Well, I don't see any federal help, so again, we're going to have to do this on our own. I see that, you know, more and more Americans, even in places like Milwaukee, never mind New York, never mind Toronto, are being priced out and can't afford. And you know, we looked at this data by economic strata. Knowledge workers, like most of us in this room, can do okay, even in high-priced places, you know, because wages are higher. Even in New York, now, you might have to live in a suburb. It's hard to live in Lower Manhattan, but, you know, the people who work for me at NYU have really lovely homes in the suburbs of New York or in an outer borough. And according to our statistics, you know, a knowledge worker has $50 or $60 or $70, or in a place like San Francisco or New York where salaries are high, maybe $80,000 or $90,000 left over on average after paying for their housing. A service worker that I mentioned, those people who work in the caring professions, who work in food preparation and retail work, largely women, largely minority, they have like 10 grand left over. It's obscene. So one, we have to make those jobs better jobs, and the book talks about that. But two, we're going to have to develop affordable housing and workforce housing. I was telling you, Mike, in Miami Beach, the mayor, who's a dear friend, because they can't get people to afford to work in the hotels, in the hospitality industries, on the cruise ships, in the restaurants. They're going to turn the municipal parking garages into affordable housing. Now, they said they're going to build over them. They're going to build affordable housing units over them. I wrote Philip a note and I said, convert the whole damn garage. But that's what they're going to do with their asset. There are so many ways you could, when developers want to have more density, and this is particularly in cities like Chicago or New York, where they want to build taller and taller towers, they need a zoning variance. And you can say, okay, yeah, we'll give you a zoning variance, but you've got to commit to either building or supporting financing because you're making so much money off this tower, supporting affordable housing. There's many ways that we can do. Universities and hospitals can pitch in because many of their employees are members of this service work. You know, NYU doesn't have affordable housing for the service workers. It has affordable housing for the professors. So they can chip in. But there's not going to be a simple solution. It's going to take all of us working together to do it.
You said you believe that we need to make service sector jobs middle-class jobs. So you're really talking about raising the minimum wage. As you know, that's controversial. There's always pushback on that. That will decrease the number of job opportunities. It'll raise prices. You've heard it all. Why do you still support that?
Well, I think one of the 2 or 3 biggest things we need to do in this country is rebuild our middle class. If we don't have a middle class, we don't have an American dream, we don't have a country, and we continue to divide. So, you know, we did it. Why do we think we can't do it? My dad was a product of it. You know, it took 9 people to make a family wage when he was a boy. Grandma working in a bakery, granddad working in a factory, my dad and his brothers and sisters all working. Dad had to leave school at 13 to get a job to support the family. He came back from the war as if by magic. He had a good job, same factory. Why? We decided that we would pay manufacturing workers better. As a country, we decided, Henry Ford said, you know, if you want to buy a car, you've got to pay. Harley Davidson, want to buy a motorcycle, you've got to pay. If you want to have a country that works, you've got to pay factory workers, who were mainly white men at the time, you've got to pay them more. We had bills that supported a union movement, collective bargaining, so I could go on. And my dad, magically, you know, his same job, same factory, his wages went up, he could buy a house, he could put his kids through school. Now the 65 or 70 million of us work in these low-wage service jobs, making 20 or 25 grand a year. We can't buy housing. We can't put food on the table. And what do? We got to make those the middle-class jobs. We can't condemn nearly half of our workforce. I mean, can you imagine? How could we condemn half of Americans to do this? So a couple of components. One, raise the minimum wage. No one size fits all. The minimum wage should vary. Just like we index benefits to inflation, we should index the minimum wage to your cost of living. So if you live in New York or Toronto or San Francisco, you get a higher minimum wage. If you live in Milwaukee, you get a slightly lower. If you live in a rural area, you might even get less than the current minimum wage, or maybe that's the floor, the current minimum wage. But we know that a minimum wage up to 50% of the metro median, does everyone understand? 50% of the prevailing average wage doesn't create these problematic effects. If you go much higher than that, if you go more than 50%, yeah, there's displacement. But up to about 50%, so in a big city, 15 bucks. I'm not sure that, I have the calculation for Milwaukee, I just don't have it here. But in a big city like New York or Seattle, San Francisco, 15 bucks an hour is about the right threshold. But not only that, the thing that I think is even more important is we've got to upgrade these service jobs. How do we do it? You know how to do this in Milwaukee. You do it the same way you made a manufacturing job better. How did Harley Davidson reinvent itself? How did Ford reinvent itself? How did these great manufacturing companies in America step up to Japanese and foreign competition? By paying their workers better, by involving them in work teams, by tapping their minds as sources of innovation, for getting them in quality circles, by implementing lean manufacturing. The best research, because I taught in this program at MIT, the best research by the same people who discovered this in manufacturing, what they say is you can do exactly the same thing for service work. Pay workers more, engage them in customer improvement. The companies like Zara or Whole Foods, I could go on, Four Seasons who do this, get better customer service, get better employee engagement, get higher rates of productivity, get better innovations in how they do work, and they combine it with a lean service strategy and they get higher productivity and profit. So it can be done, but we've got to make a national commitment because we can't condemn, 65, 70 million Americans, 45% of our workforce to the kind of low-wage, precarious work they're currently doing.
Part of inclusive urbanism, you say, is investing in people and places. One of the examples you gave, I think, was investing in early childhood education. Yeah, that's an interesting reaction. You kind of smiled when I said that.
How do we condemn kids? I mean, I have two. You know, we give them everything. We have, that's a whole separate symposium on having children late in life and IVF. Holy shit. Here I am, 59, with two little kids.
Good luck.
Yeah. But the benefit of that is we have enough income and enough saving and enough time that we invest everything in them. You know, really, there's 2 or 3 people with a minimum most of the day. And we know what the payoff to that is. I came from that kind of environment. My dad worked. My mom stayed at home. She could only stay at home until we got into kindergarten when she had to go back to work. But, you know, I came from this. So we know that an investment in our kids, exposing them to books, exposing them to words, is what's key to their development. I mean, it's like the most important investment we could make in this country is early childhood development. I mean, you can't fix it. This is one you can't fix, and the cost of doing it is so inexpensive compared to the disbenefit of not doing it. So these are things I just don't understand, and you know, most of the advanced nations of the world, certainly Toronto, where I live, has extensive. Never mind my colleagues from Sweden who were like, you mean women have to like think twice about work or not work? No, this is all just taken care of. And we lose people in the workforce because they have to be so anyway, I think extensive, well-developed childcare systems and extensive pre-K is just things we have to do if we want to make sure our people and our communities are stronger.
You're a big advocate, and we've heard that already today, but a big advocate for giving more power, I guess that's the best way to put it, giving more power to local municipalities, to mayors, to county executives, to people who are closer to the people than you might be at the state level or at the federal level.
Well, you know, here I had to get clobbered over the head. In this book, this is the second version. I wrote this book, the first version, and I sent it in, I think it was November 5th, 6th, or 7th, and there was a whole last chapter. Really interesting. I loved it when I wrote it. The new president, Clinton, should create a Department of Cities and Urban Development, expanding the mandate of the Department of Housing and Urban Development to focus on city betterment and city investing and housing structures and affordable housing and transit, bringing together all interagency. And the president should create a National Council on Cities, coincident and similar to the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, to give that president advice, bringing together the best mayors and best urbanists and developers and anchor institution leaders to solve our urban problems. And then I woke up on Election Day. And our party really stunk. We had the mule, by the way. We had the mule, the cutouts we had to have my wife's sister-in-laws. My wife's from Michigan. We had to have the mule, the cutouts of Hillary and Donald from Michigan in an SUV because we couldn't get, these life-size cutouts. We dressed the baby up in red, white, and blue. We dressed the little puppy up. Yeah, it was a morose party. But my wife woke up the next day and, she said, I kind of feel crappy. And I realized something about this. That as bad as I felt for women, there was a different thing going on that I never really understood with Mrs. Clinton. My wife was just shattered, And she said, if we feel like this, look, we live in a beautiful house, we have 2 beautiful kids, the little puppy's still in a red, white, and blue outfit. If we feel like this, and we're doing pretty good, imagine if the tables were turned and Trump Nation had lost. And imagine the backlash and the anger and the fear among people who aren't as well off as us, Richard. It's unbelievable, the divide. So at that moment, I called my publisher. I said, I got to take back the book. She's like, no, it'll be fine. I'm like, it will not be fine. I'll look like an idiot. We got to pull back the book. I've got to rewrite it. And so I did a lot of thinking, and I'm going to be writing more on this. Really, we got to reduce the stakes. The reason that we have this national trauma, this low-grade political civil war, is because we've put all the stakes in this one person. A country of 350 million people, 350 metros, 3,500 counties, thousands and thousands of cities and towns. We've projected all this power on the one savior. What if we thought about ourselves differently? What if we thought about ourselves like the country the founders built, which is power from the ground up? right? That we've handed this power over to our states. We've handed this power over to the federal government. What if we said, what if red and blue America just can peacefully coexist? If I want to live a blue lifestyle and I want to pay more taxes and have more transit and have more affordable housing, go for it. If you want to live a more red lifestyle and live in a place that has less transit and has, less taxes, do it. We can go on and on. But I think we could, and the startling statistic is, I just looked at this yesterday. I'm writing a piece for Politico magazine, so I had to look at it. Americans' faith in their national government is at record low. When I was born when Eisenhower was president and President Kennedy, 3/4 of us had faith in our federal government. Now less than 20% of us do. Our faith in our state and local governments have never been higher. 60% of Americans believe that they can trust their state government, and over 3/4 of us believe that we can trust and have confidence in our local governments. So that tells me that Americans believe that we can do things at the local level, and I can't tell partisan different. I tell you, when I meet a mayor, I can't tell, is that he or she, Republican, Democrat, because they're solving problems. So I think we can give power back to the cities, and they call this, the academic term, the legal term, I'm not a lawyer, although my mom would be really proud of me. She really wanted me to be a lawyer. Just talking in a law school. It's called subsidiarity. You give power to the most immediate and local level. That's how you should distribute power in a federalist system, to the most immediate and local level that can solve that problem. And we hand over sovereign power from our localities to states and hand over money to our national governments. And if they're not doing what we like, we should take it back. So that's what I'm going to address the U.S. Conference of Mayors 2 weeks from now about this. But I think we can see, and what I mentioned to Mike earlier, climate change is not my issue. So it's not an issue I know a lot about. But look, we now have 264 cities and communities of all shapes and sizes, 10 states, over 1,000 corporations, and several hundred universities that have agreed to sign on to the Paris Accord because they disagree with the president. And these are Republican and Democrat. These are bipartisan. This is telling me that there is something happening in America. So I think the way to our future, in addition to upgrading those jobs building, I think that the best way to our future is to give our power back to our cities and our communities and to respect one another's differences. I don't want to impose my way of life on you. You don't impose your way of life on me. And we can agree to disagree, and we can agree to coexist together.
You have said, and then we'll take questions here from the audience, the answer to some of these challenges is more, not less, urbanism. How did you come to that conclusion?
The arc of history is on our side. In 1800, 3% of us lived in urban areas. That's cities and suburban metropolitan areas. 1900, about 10% of us did. 1950, 15 or 20% of us did. Now across the world, half of us do. Do you know that in the next century, we are going to put more people in cities than currently live in cities now in the world? We are going to put 3 to 4 or 5 billion more people in cities, mainly across the rapidly urbanizing world. And we're going to spend more money building cities, more hundreds of trillions of dollars building cities than we have throughout all of past history. We're an urban world. So we are going to become more urban, not less. And when I say urban, I don't mean just packed into little urban neighborhoods. I mean metropolitan areas, clusters of cities and suburbs in an economically integrated area. Urbanism, density, if you will, is the key to productivity. It's not amassing technology, it's not amassing knowledge workers, it's not having bigger factories. The key to improving productivity and innovation comes from the density and clustering of diverse groups of people. We know this in economics. It is really the driver, it is the basic mechanic of economic development. The more dense, the more urban you are, the more productive you are, the more your living standards rise. So now we have to just move that system from a winner-take-all urbanism, which benefits, just like the factory system, right? Think about the great struggles in Milwaukee 100 years ago. The factories were producing wealth for robber barons and the workers were being left behind. This economist named Karl Marx, he wrote whole books about this. William Blake called them the satanic mills. But ultimately, we decided that everyone should participate in the benefits of the industrial age, and we built a strong working class and working middle class. Same thing we have to do now, and why I'm optimistic is I actually think it's hard for cities to neglect these problems. It was easier when the rich all lived in the suburbs and the poor were in the cities, and the suburbs can almost create a gated corridor around them. But now when we're so mixed up, when there's more poverty in the suburbs and more affluence there, and certainly much more affluence in the cities, whether you take Mayor Hidalgo of Paris, Mayor Peduto of Pittsburgh, Mayor de Blasio in New York, Mayor Garcetti in LA, I could go on, they're really having to manage this. They're having to manage a whole sets of groups of population. So in that sense, I think the political contestation around cities makes it much more likely that they will begin to address these problems. And I think why I'm really optimistic is what I see in Milwaukee. When I walk those streets and I see all you've accomplished, and I remember, I think it was Nordquist who invited me here the first time, way back when. And he was pointing at little things that you were starting to do downtown. And the river, we're going to do some stuff over here, and there's a thing coming over here. And I'm looking around, great, good luck with that. No, but every city I went and saw this, and we're going to do this over here. And then I come back, Indianapolis. Huh? Columbus, I taught at Ohio State. I look at Columbus, I don't even recognize Columbus anymore. Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, where he survived. One of my best friends got shot. He survived. He just got shrapnel from the door, but that's neither here nor there. Another kid that was my student at Carnegie Mellon got mugged. I walked in downtown Philadelphia. It was filled with young people. The streets were teeming. It was party, party, party. Never mind what I saw in Milwaukee and the roof. So we accomplished this urban revival in a way that I could have never predicted. We brought cities back from the dead. From the dead. Look at what's happened. My wife's from Detroit. When I go, I spend every Thanksgiving in Detroit. I go to the parade, and I go to the game. Detroit? How did this happen? Detroit was the last place you would think you'd see an urban revival. If we could do that in 10 to 15 years, taking the urban revival and making it more inclusive, yeah, it's hard, but I think we've already done the harder part. Now we just have to, it's like we built the factory system and we built these great companies, now we had to include more people. I think we can get there, but the thing is it's going to take all of our effort. It's not something that anyone's going to hand us. Our states are not going to hand it to it. Our federal government's not going to hand it to it. There's going to be a lot of opposition, so it's going to take local people, local institutions, local anchors, local community groups, and really getting over this hang-up we have in cities where some people say we want growth and development and other people say we want equity and redistribution. I want growth and you want redistribution. They're the same darn thing. Building, and that's why I call it urbanism for all or inclusive prosperity. You're not going to have prosperity if people aren't included. You're not going to have inclusion without prosperity. They go hand in hand. And what makes me so, every place I've gone in the country, mayors and the heads of presidents of universities, anchor institutions have wanted to talk about this and wanted to say, well, how do we do it? I have to say, unfortunately, I'm a professor, so I don't know how to do it. You know how to do it. And this is what my great mentor, Jane Jacobs, taught me. I can give you a broad view. You do it in your community. Every community is different. There is no one size fits all. What works in Milwaukee may not work in Cleveland, certainly won't work in Birmingham or Houston or New York or San Francisco. We know best. Our neighborhoods, our communities know best. So that's where it starts. And from what I've heard and what I've seen, you guys seem to be taking. It seems like my book came at the right moment anyway, because you guys seem, without me, you seem to be taking all the right steps and moving in this direction quite nicely on your own.
Let me take a few questions. You know the routine. If you're in the bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, but on the rim. If you're in the back, raise your hand and we'll take a question. I'm going to go to the back here first time. We're going to start with this gentleman, then we'll go over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks, Professor Florida. Our former mayor, John Norquist, 2 weeks ago published a blog post in Urban Milwaukee making the same point about the federal government. So I'd encourage you and everyone to read that. I'm curious to hear you describe the urbanist you were before you wrote the creative class to the urbanist you are today.
Older, more gray hair. I think I'm still the same person. And in the book I talk about how I just grew from a kid in Newark, watched the riots in Newark, watched my city burn, to being so taken by the urban revival in New York City and seeing the green shoots of the urban revival, to understanding the growth and development and transformation of Pittsburgh, to being knocked in the head by my life in Toronto and the election of Rob Ford and the separation and divide in this country. So I still think I'm a detective, a researcher, an empiricist, trying to understand the growth and development of what I think is our greatest, the greatest thing we've done as human beings is build communities and cities and towns and thriving urban metropolitan areas filled with, it's our greatest achievement. So I've been trying to understand what drives their growth, how they affect the economy, and I think my big change, if you will, was understanding that motor, left to its own devices and without guidance, was not pulling up all the boats, was pulling up very few boats. Very few cities and metropolitan areas and very few groups. So I think that was my big shift. And I think partly there's a couple reasons for that. One, the world changed, but two, when you are fortunate like me to have gained a public platform, to be invited to write books and write essays for newspapers or magazines or online, to give speeches, you get critics. And the first thing you go is, oh my God, they hate me, and that's not me, and they should love me, and they want to be loved. And then you realize, no, they have a really valid point, and that's what critics are for. They're there to help you fix the things you got wrong. Now, you might not like the way it sounds when you first read it, but I found that I've had both on the left and the right really good critics that caused me to introspect and to challenge my own thoughts and to adapt to new realities. And I think that's been really, it's been both the changing circumstance, but also having really smart and good critics that made me a different kind of person.
Let's go right over here. Ryan, you want to?
Didn't hear you.
No, I'm going to go back there. I'll get to, yeah, no problem.
Hello. So I have two questions. I'm going to just state them and then I'm going to explain. My first one is, can you define the middle class? And the second one is, how will we deal with the lifestyle issues? You've used the term middle class multiple times during your lecture today, and middle class is used in politics and social stuff all around the world, but we have people who are making just above minimum wage who consider themselves middle class, and people who make $1 million a year who consider themselves middle class, and you get kind of some confusion when you're talking about the middle class, and there's such a wide breadth there. And also, in talking about economics and people's ability to have a living wage, there is also the issue of the lifestyle that we've kind of grown into as a country, where your media, where your social interactions all involve spending money, or somehow trying to keep up with, who you see on TV, or your lifestyle is supposed to be a certain way. So how do we deal with that when thinking about the increase in separation between the groups?
So the word I would use for that is Kardashianization. When I saw Kim and her sisters driving around New York City in a giant SUV like it was a suburban mall, I said, oh shit. Sorry. You're right. We've had this incredible, look, I grew up, my parents had a suburban house, but it was very small. I don't think we had 1,000 square feet. They rented the top part of it. It would look like what people would consider a low income. When I look at the NYU apartments, this is very interesting. They're basically 850 square foot apartments with a large family room, small kitchen, 1 bath, 2 small bedrooms, no closet space. You can barely put 3 suits in there. And that's where people raise a family of 4. So this whole idea that every one of us needs 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 Kardashian Calabasas mansion and 3 SUVs in the driveway, it's a big part of the problem. But it's subject, it is unbelievable, this escalation in what we think is the good life, because all that stuff is really meaningless, actually. The income thing, I was looking at the book because I was trying to find what we use. I define class in 2 ways, so your point is very spot on. When I use my terms for class, I define them by your relationship to the economy. So I define class occupationally. The knowledge, professional, and creative workers who use their minds and are paid well. The service workers who use their routine physical labor and sometimes emotional labor but are paid poorly. And the blue-collar workers who use their physical labor to make things. So that's the way I define it. In the middle class, when I use middle class, I use that lower, upper middle differently. I defer to the standard income-based explanations of class. I don't have the statistic at hand, it's in the book, but we use the commonly used definition of the middle class, which is some share quartiles. I don't know if it's 25th to 75th percent or 33rd to 66%, some share of, some range of income. So we use the statistics that the Pew Research Center uses, and that two very, very good researchers, two sociologists, Bischoff and Reardon, define those income statistics. So, but very good questions.
Other question? Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't hear you spend time on the black-white tension in the cities, which in our city or in this greater area remains quite pervasive. And I look at the police problems in other cities. My question is, do you have any cogent suggestions for improving racial relations in the cities?
To be honest, I often feel constrained on speaking to these issues because of who I am. I'm a white, middle-aged professional man. But that said, qualifying that statement that way, these are the issues that most affect me, that most affected my development. I talk in the book about witnessing the race riots in Newark as a young boy, seeing my city go up in flames, seeing the tanks in the street, having my dad, when the shots were being fired, say, "Get on the floor, Rich." I think that's what made me an urbanist, was race. That I couldn't understand what was happening in my country, that African-American people being denied rights, being denied economic opportunity, that our cities would explode. And then as I learned, because of the violence of police incidents, I learned this, and I think that was, and then my father's factory being shuttered, the industrialization. I think those are the things as a young boy, a 10, 12-year-old boy, that really propelled me into urbanism. I've shied away from racial issues for a whole host of reasons, but in this book I decided that because one young woman, African-American woman, really hit hard at me. It was so nice to engage her after she saw the book. She said, "That really made you read my little article?" She criticized some maps. I made some segregation maps, and she said, "But that's race." And, you know, I wrote in the book, but I didn't want to deal with race. So now I had to. She called me out. I talk in the book about this, you know, race and economic inequality and segregation are all bound up together. We talked about gentrification earlier, Mike and I. The startling finding of Rob Sampson that gentrification tends to occur in upgrading in either industrial zones, like where the Iron Horse is, parts of the meatpacking district in New York, or in white working class neighborhoods. If a neighborhood's 45% racial minority, it tends not to be improved and just declines. Those are stark issues. And by the way, I don't talk about this a lot, but I think it's why Canada's different where I live. I think the legacy of our racial issues in this country are something we continue to try to brush away, but really make us different. They're maybe the key to American so-called exceptionalism and still our divides. I've pledged to a couple of younger women who are African-American that I'm going to work with them on these issues because I think they're so important. But your point is these issues of economic inequality and segregation and urban change are very much nested with race, and it's something that we as a society have to, and cities have to get our arms around.
I think we are just about out of time. Does anybody have something they can ask really fast? Press down on the rim if you would. Yeah. There we go.
This?
It's magic.
Oh, excuse me. Very simple.
That's good.
When I hear you talk, I haven't read your book, so
It's okay.
I don't know where I am on this. I hear you talk about simple answers. We know the answers. We just have to do it. Complicated. The answer is out there somewhere. We just have to find the resources and the people to help us get there. Complex, which we don't know what we're doing. We have to probe. We have to frame. We have to ask questions, experiment. And then there's chaos. Urban crisis is, for me, complex, bordering on disorder and chaos. So where's the space? Where do you see the space for that kind of work to be done? Because we're so tied to this technical, rational, going linear from point A to B. Where's the space for that in all of what you're talking about?
Thank you for that great question. So now I have to, Dr. Oz has to come from outside of the curtain. I learned this by writing Rise of the Creative Class, that I could give voice through my work. It's not original. People ask me if anything, I said this to a journalist. I said, no, nothing I do is original. It is all just built off the great work other scholars do and cities do. And I tie it all together in a narrative that gives voice. And I'm a pretty good storyteller. So what I did in Rise of the Creative Class was give voice to this idea that there could be an urban revival. I didn't say how to do it. I said, in all of your cities, you can do it. And magically, having nothing to do with me, an urban revival came about. In making that argument, I also said that, you know, it wasn't only about technology, it was about human talent, it was about tolerance and diversity. That the places that would be successful would have a maximum amount of diversity, give men and women and young and old and racial minorities, Hispanic, Latino, African American, Asian, disabled, all-body, gay and straight opportunity. So this book, I decided that the world needed a different narrative. In all that complexity and all that disorganization and all that emergence and all that chaos, that what I could do, because I was listening, I'm a good listener, is create a new narrative. And that new narrative would be very simple. We have to move from a winner-take-all urbanism to an urbanism for all. We have to move from a divided society to an inclusive society. We have to bring together inclusion and prosperity. No template for doing it. A couple of 7 silos that you should work on, housing and job creation and transit. But all of us are going to do that differently. That there's no model for doing it. Someone says, is any city doing it right? No. We're all doing it differently and nobody's doing it right and it's warts and all. So I tried to create the narrative that could spur, that could focus attention on the problem and activate and become something that can help activate and give voice. So that's all I've tried to do it in my own way, and I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate to have a platform, somebody like Marquette University Law School and Mike invite me here and that I can give voice to this. I do think the next step would be to try to organize, or I shouldn't even say they're organized, but to try to help the organizations that have many, many cities participating in them, to help them take the next steps, and that's what I'm going to try to do. But basically, folks, I am really a thinker. You know, at the end of the day, I sit in a little room. It's a boring life. I sit in a little room with a computer and think thoughts and write them down. That's what I do. I'm not a politician. I'm not a mayor. I'm not in whatever. So I try to make sense of this complex world, but to your point, to try to make sense of it in a way that many, many different chaotic, disorganized local points of action can be activated. And I'm just so incredibly heartened by what I see in so many communities around this country and around the world.
I'm going to wrap things up there. Before we go, I invite you again to always check out our website, law.marquette.edu. We do have another event yet this month. It's later in the month, and we'll be talking about the subject of community policing. And a national expert will be here to talk about that with us. You can find out more information on that at our website. Again, thanks so much for your interest and your attendance today. We really appreciate you being here. And most of all, thanks to the author of The New Urban Crisis, Professor Richard Flores. Great to have you. Thank you.